There you go. So STM is committed to complying with applicable competition and antitrust laws. Please refrain from disclosing or asking about competitively sensitive information. If a panelist or audience member believes any such information is being disclosed or sought, that individual should interrupt to point out their objections and to request that such activity be stopped and leave the webinar if it does not. With that, so welcome to everybody again. And Mitchell, I hand over the floor to you.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon for everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining. As you know, text and data mining and AI have been very on the forefront of many people's minds, and having AI systems that are actually going out and doing text and data mining on your content can be worrisome. So we started this task and finish group to actually kind of address what could be done to express rights and reservations on content that you may have or that is being distributed elsewhere from another publisher, let's say. So I want to thank the task and finish group that was represented by these organizations. Everybody contributed a lot to this and really put in a lot of thought to this. And so I really think that the effort was such a great team effort there. So let's start on this. So essentially right now, as you know, and this is the typical text and data mining process that you'd see on your websites that happen. So text and data mining bots come in, or just regular, maybe independent publishers or independent researchers may come in and do some text and data mining on your website. So they'll be crawling through that content, and then actually pulling that in to eventually use it for maybe AI training or statistical analysis or anything like that. So, but as you know, with publishers, there is a different story that may come up, and that is content that is maybe in syndication or released to other publishers that may actually then may put it out on their website. Now you've lost control of that content, and other AI crawlers can now actually go in, text and data mine that content, and then use it in AI solutions. So that was the other part of this that we were looking at to try and figure out how do we address both scenarios in this case. So also the major part of this, the reason why we had brought this together was that the EU digital single market directive put out 2 articles, and you're seeing here Article 4, which is the major one here, where if there is no limitation or exception put on a piece of content, that content can be text and data mined if they have if a miner or somebody, and we call them TDM actors, have lawful access to that content. Now you'll see here in paragraph 3, basically the way to limit that is to have something that is managed on, can be marked on the content that is in a preferably machine readable means, to then say, yes, there is a reservation on this content, and here's what you can and cannot do with that content, the actions that the actor can take at that point. So those are the 2 major ones that we were talking about with our community group. But there's also Article 3, which basically states that any nonprofit or cultural heritage site that has lawful access to content can text and data mine that content for research purposes. So that's also another thing to keep in mind, is that it's not just free for all on text and data mining to use whatever you want. It's strictly for research purposes. And the same thing with Article 4 in that manner. So we started looking at, well, what are some of the ways we can actually recommend that publishers or anybody that distributes content to put a reservation on this content. So first, the idea that, okay, maybe you should change your copyright statement. Now that's not a machine readable means, but it is something that would then be visible to people to the actors that are setting up these AI crawlers, that there is a reservation on this and you should stop before thinking about doing any text and data mining. But also there are, for some of the larger players, the robots.txt file that's on your website does have means for agents or that actually can be specified, such as ChatGPT or Gemini or anything else that's out there, to say, here's what you can and can't do from a crawling perspective. It's very similar to what your Google search would do, and it wouldn't limit Google search because Google has two separate agents for that kind of thing. So that's another thing that we recommend, is make sure that you keep up with all of the agents that are out there for your robots, and put that and update your robots.txt to guard against any of the larger players to actually doing a lot of this work. Now, that doesn't really help with anybody that's maybe an independent researcher or a university or institution of any kind that may be doing that text and data mining as well. So the other thought here, and still something that, of course, I know a lot of publishers of websites do, is whitelisting, blacklisting, preventing doing things on for your firewall that would actually prevent access from certain players if need be. So that's, of course, it's a bit cumbersome because now you've got to keep up with where are they coming in, how are they identified, things like that. You don't want to block people that are legitimately wanting to look at your content and have them using that content in the inappropriate way. So, but still recommend that you should have these rules on your firewall, of course. So the last thing that we came up with, these two are, of course, a little bit more general, those last two. There is another solution that we had looked at, and that is something called TDM rep. Now, that's done by the W3C. That was a recommendation that they had put out about, I think, 2 years ago. Now and we're going to show you some of the examples of this, but what that essentially does is you can have multiple media files, multiple approaches for actually how content can be identified and how to tell it what you want to do with that content. So the advantage of TDM rep is all of those different means of accessing content point to one central policy. So the advantage there is then that I can change that policy as I go along, and it's always referring to the most current policy in that case. Or I can have multiple policies depending on the type of content, but normally you'd want to have one central policy, and all of the different media that you have would point to that policy. So the first part of TDM rep, the basic part of TDM rep, is for HTML web pages or sites in general. So what you're seeing here is 3 different approaches to how you can identify a rights reservation on your website. The first being they call it the TDM rep JSON site file or site level. So that up there is essentially looks like a robots.txt file and it's put in actually the same directory as your robots.txt file on your website. So when you see that file, it'll say from whatever location you want, in this case, the root directory. So basically everything from there below is now, it has a reservation. That's that flag here, TDM reservation 1 or 0, and a TDM policy. And there's a URL associated with that. So yes, there is a reservation on any content in this directory and below. And here's the policy associated with it that's machine readable. We'll get to what that looks like in a little bit. You can also have it so it's TDM reservation 0, meaning there is no reservation on any content in that directory or below. The second part of that, and the more granular way of doing that, is actually putting in that same flag and policy in your HTTP header. So the response, when somebody goes to your website and hits a page, having the response come back saying, hey, there is, yes, I've served you the content, but there is also a reservation on it and there's a policy. So each individual page will give you, and then that means you can tweak each individual piece of content how you want to in that case. So that's also, again, on when you're actively accessing a website. The third is actually embedding that same flag and policy in the HTML itself. So for instance, if somebody pulled off the HTML, stored it somewhere else, that HTML has that in the metadata, that same policy reservation and that same policy URL. Now, and these are in order of precedence, keep in mind too. So if you had metadata stored that usurps anything above, that basically takes the place of anything from the header and from the site. So the finer grain you go, the more precedence it has. Oh, and this is also available. You can use that within EPUB as well. So if I go back to that, yeah, so this is not just HTML, but it's the same approach when you're using EPUB. So the thought was, okay, well, wait a minute. That's great for HTML. What about PDFs? And how do we get it so that when somebody downloads a PDF, that metadata is still in it? So we extended the W3C's recommendation for TDM rep to include it in what's called XMP metadata within the PDF. Essentially, if you were on a PDF, and let's say you're in Acrobat and you go file properties, those metadata pieces are in that file properties. But what you're basically seeing is the same thing. Is there a reservation, and where is it? What's the URL of that reservation? So now that's portable. Now that's going with the document itself. So what about PDFs and any content that may have been already distributed and doesn't have that metadata in it? So that was the other recommendation we've come up with. Sorry, by the way, with the PDF recommendation, the W3C now has put this in their recommendation as well. So this is now an official part of the TDM recommendation. But getting back to what if your content is actually now out in the wild and you can't get back and actually put in metadata to it, or maybe it's too cumbersome because you have millions of PDFs out there or things like that. We had worked with the Crossref to actually say, okay, how can we update metadata within Crossref to then tell it, here's a reservation. And there is a way to do that. So within Crossref, you can actually update, and you can see here with the metadata, you would just put in the policy URL, and that is essentially, it's like turning on the flag for reservation and giving the policy URL. So the presence of that metadata and that URL for the policy file indicates that there is a rights reservation. So if somebody went to a Crossref and said, here's my DOI, give me the metadata, it would return back saying, hey, there is a reservation, here's where it is. So the policy that we've been talking about, what that essentially is it's made up of what's called the ODRL, Open Digital Rights Language. It's another W3C recommendation and another standard, essentially. It was mainly used essentially by the music industry for rights reservation and for determining what actions to take, but it can very well be used, and I can show a lot of the different actions that can be used within the open rights digital language. But what you're seeing here is when you get to a point where you pull down the policy file, you specify a target, which is essentially a collection of content. So that could be multiple DOIs, that could be your entire site, for instance. For ACS, that is the entire site, pubs.acs.org. That is our target, meaning everything on the site is under this reservation, under this policy. So if the action, which here is TDM mine, that was done by the W3C as part of this, then you must obtain consent if, and here's the constraint saying, if your purpose of, if you are doing things and here not equal to Article 3. So remember, I was talking about Article 3 before, that those are nonprofits and cultural heritage sites doing things for research purposes. So anything outside of that, your duty is to obtain consent. So now it's clear and machine readable to any actor or any robot crawler that, hey, you must go and contact us. Now the policy file, and I can get into this with the technical session, that it has all the ways of contacting the publisher and what has more details on licensing information and things like that. But essentially here, and this is very flexible, so you can have multiple targets, you can have multiple actions on certain targets. So that's why you could get a very large policy file if you wanted to. Now, keep in mind for ACS, we've made it very simple, and I'll show you that in a little bit, that essentially our entire website, you want to obtain consent. So kind of going back to reviewing what we were talking about, the main advantage to this now is that depending on the type of content you have or the situation you have with your content, it all points back to a centralized TDM policy file that then says, yes, there's a reservation. Here's what you need to do with that. And if there's updates that need to happen or something changes, that policy file can be changed. And now people see the current version of that and see what needs to be done there. So what are the advantages of this? Well, it's very easy to implement. That TDM rep JSON file that is essentially looks like a robots TXT file could be put on your website within a matter of minutes. It's basically two files. One is that TDM rep JSON, which looks like a robots TXT file, and your policy file. And that's it. It's much more extensible. So like we were talking about and showing there, we added our own actor or our own purpose and constraint that said, if you're Article 3, you have these kinds of constraints, or if you're not Article 3, you have these kinds of constraints. So we can extend it to even more. So let's just say the US starts putting in some constraints for and laws in for AI. You can actually, and text and data mining, you could put that in here as well. And when these kinds of protocols can work with things like Crossref. So now any data that now or content that is now outside of your control, we can then tag it with metadata. But that also means that this is flexible enough for other emerging content formats. So things like, and maybe some of you have heard of it, but it's called the ISCC, International Standard Content Code, I believe it's called, and another one called C2PA, which basically embed, or well, one of them embeds that metadata inside of any piece of content. The other, ISCC, creates a code and then creates a centralized lookup, sort of similar to Crossref, where it can tell you that, hey, this content has been modified or has been tampered with, but it has all the metadata stored with it to say, here's the rights reservation on this. This is a similar, somebody stripped the metadata out of, let's say, out of this PDF, but the lookup would actually say this is 85% similar, and it does have a reservation on it. We can, if anybody has questions on ISCC, we can talk to you about that a little bit. But and also the big advantage here also is that this has been established now. A lot of publishers are already using this TDM rep, including ourselves, ACS and Elsevier. And I know Springer is actually looking at, they're very close to being implementing on that as well. So, and yeah, in summary, TDM rep in conjunction with a whole bunch of other things that you normally would be doing anyway, as far as robots and firewall rules and copyright statements, is a good combination of things to actually it's not prevention in a lot of ways, but it's more, it is acting like a copyright, where you're now saying, hey, there is a reservation on this. Please be responsible. Please come to contact us on what needs to be done. Any questions?
Thanks, Mitchell. Let's see if anything comes up. I don't think that I've seen anything in the chat. And for now, it looks like there is no hands up. Do you want to pass over to the rest that you wanted to show? Go
Sure.
through the policy, the files and how all of these things look like when implemented. See if there's anything that raises questions there.
Yep. So as you're seeing here, this is the website for the W3C TDM rep. Just if you Google TDM rep, you'll get a reference to this. And also if you Google on ODRL, you'll get some of that on there as well. I mentioned before with ODRL and the policy file vocabulary that there are a number of actions or duties that you can do that you saw in that policy file. And this is the various ones that are out of the box for ODRL. Of course, these can be extended if need be, but a lot of them are really, so for instance, things like attribution. So if you have CC BY license, BY licenses and things like that, and you need to do attribution, you can specify that inside the policy file, not just things like obtain consent. So that's another thing to look at on that. Here is a typical, when looking at a policy file, you'll see that there's a reference to, and actually maybe I should bring that up first. So here is an example policy file. And I'll bring to your attention here that the assigner portion of this file is really what says this is the contact information or the publisher's information here. So things like an email address, or then also the URL for licensing and more information. So for instance, here is the assigner contact information for ACS, and it has a very rich set of data for it's basically a vCard standard for that part of the portion of the policy file. And then you can see here then you have a permission section where you do have that target I was mentioning, that collection of data, and always having that action of TDM mine. So having then here that action ECS is using is obtain consent. But if I go to another example here, that same set of that permission set can have multiple permissions. So you're seeing here the target may be a collection of open access research papers. In that case, you're free to text and data mine that. There is no duty, there is no action, there is no constraint on that. So this collection is free to open for data mining. The second one is, say, a set of paywall or set of subscription-based access papers that don't fall under that OA license, for instance. That one, you must obtain consent if you're doing text and data mining. But that same target says also that if you have those research papers and you are an Article 3 actor, you have the right to text and data mine that content. So that gives you that, depending on who is accessing your content, you can tell them what your actions should be. But I'll also go back to that vCard has URL is very important in that, and we recommend you putting that in because it will provide a website or web page to provide more information about things like what are those collections, or what are your rights in plain English, or your the legalese that you would want to use inside of here. So that's what you're seeing here. This is the Elsevier version of that text and data. The TDM rep has URL. So I can show you as well, let's just do real time here, how they would access the text and data, the TDM policy file and TDM ref JSON. So for our site, for pubs ACS, we would have, you would have it always in your well-known directory where your robots.txt file is. And so when I access that, I'll zoom in because this is going to be a little bit small. That then says, okay, here's the root directory, and there is a reservation on everything here. So go to this URL here. And if I do that, put that in here. There you go. So that is that same policy file you were seeing earlier. So this is something that is machine readable. They can come in and say, oh, yes, I have to obtain consent. And I am text and data mining, so I must obtain consent. Questions?
Yeah, I see that now there are a couple, so maybe we can take those.
Sure.
So the first one is, if a publisher does not have the technical resources to implement this, can a publisher service provider, so like a typesetter or platform, do the implementation for the publisher?
Yes. So, and in fact, a lot of times you do have other vendors that are servicing your website for delivery and things like that. Absolutely. That it's basically as a matter, if you have robots.txt or something similar to that on your website, whoever's managing your website, you would put this on the website, just 2 files to put in your well-known directory. So you don't necessarily have to have control of your website. If somebody else is doing it, you can tell them, and we can give you templates on how to actually craft these policy files, but then you just deposit those files on your website.
Yeah, so depending on what type of publisher we're talking about, the infrastructure, the systems will be different, but in theory, there is that opportunity.
Right.
And the other question is, how effective is the TDM rep protocol so far? Is it recognized by crawlers? What experiences can you share?
So I can share experiences from the ACS side of things that what we've seen is, now keep in mind, again, as I mentioned, it's not something that actually blocks your people from text and data mining, because that content, you want to have people looking at your content, especially if they have lawful access to that content. But what we have seen is that we do have an uptick in people contacting us saying, hey, I am falling under an Article 3. I am an EU nonprofit. I fall under Article 3. I am using this for research purposes. And then we give them consent to say, yes, go ahead and do that. So we've seen a lot more activity in that respect, that now that we have that contact information directly in that policy file, there's no need to go hunting around on the website to find out who do I need to contact.
Yeah, so an increase in direct questions, and in that way you open up the dialogue with, what can become a partnership eventually. So
Exactly.
that's positive experience from your side. So thanks.
Mm-hmm.
These were the 2 questions.
I can also go through some of the FAQs that we've assembled already, just to kind of give people an idea of what other questions have been asked. So just bear in mind, if you are a member, so we do have a website for this Article 4T task and finish group, and there is a publicly available technical summary on this page. But for the members area, there is also an infographic here that gives you just a very tight summary of the recommendation, but the full recommendation with with detailed ideas of how to construct that policy file. And also FAQs are here. So the FAQs, if I zoom in a little more on that, the recommendation indicates that publishers should point to an HTML landing page where policies on TDM, including AI usage, are spelled out. This can be done, for example, in a JSON policy file. Does the STM group recommend language to place on the landing page? So that's, again, what we were talking about, that has URL that's inside the policy file, can provide much more, then you can point to and have much more detail about what are, based on certain licenses that you may have on content, here's what you can do with that content. And it also gives you probably more reasons to say, okay, if you have questions, here's our contact information as well. But we don't recommend specific wording that's more really for your own legal purposes. Yeah. So the other one is, how do you do any kind of, if you're CCBY, you want to make sure that there is attribution on some of that content. How do I recognize that in the policy file? And you can see that here. You can actually say, and we were going back to that with the actions that are in the ODRL, that I can have an action of attribution. So if I know it is CCBY content, oops, there we go, that is attribution. And then finally, one of the other questions was, okay, and we were touching on this too, is there are other formats that are emerging out there. How do does this play around? Does this play with this? And yeah, and actually, in some ways, I feel that this is a complementary, and a lot of feedback that's been out there in the industry now has already said that this is a complementary way of doing things, is that instead of having to worry about embedding content or things like ISCC and C2PA, which are very good standards to have and actually protect a lot more than just text and data mining, that's beneficial to have. But having TDM rep along with it allows you to provide a more current version of your policy and contact information, so that people can actually say, hey, what kind of rights, specific rights do I have on this content?
And I think the final point on the FAQs is, if you have more questions, what you do, we set up an email address that everyone can get in touch with. So, if you think of anything after this presentation that you still want to ask, you want to have another conversation with us, with Mitchell, with Bjorn, do feel free to reach out to article4@stm-assault.org. We'll circulate this information also after the webinar, so you'll have it handy. But that's certainly a possibility. I mean, there's been loads of work, and we were lucky to also build on the TDM rep work that has been done. But of course, other questions and other use cases will come up. So we're very happy to keep the conversation going. If there is nothing else, we can wrap up. Bjorn, yes?
Just one point, because we mentioned that we embedded PDF into the TDM rep protocol with the specification, and there was a question within our group, if you modify the XMP and point to a namespace, and then it must have to be PDFA compliant. There must be a schema being deposited, and we have taken the actions to do that. We developed a small little schema and provided that to the TDM Rep community group. I'm not sure if it's yet up, but I think that's going with the next round, it would go up. So once that schema is up, how to embed TDM Rep in the XMP of a PDF, then also the PDFs would be PDFA compliant, because the schema would be hopefully soon being published. So because PDFA, I think, is at least in the STM sector also very, very important for us to have that.
Yeah,
that's a topic on their approval for the next
Yes.
W3C meeting for them. Yeah, that will, and more than likely it will be approved and then put on their website.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So confirming that things are very much moving on this, and we will build more experience with TDM actors and crawlers as more publishers implement, as we gain well, as we enter into these conversations. So we'll have more to share. And if anyone wants to share anything with us or ask anything, you will know where to find us. For now, I think that this is all from us. So thank you very much again, and talk to you all soon. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You.